When Barbara Hutton died inside a penthouse suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, the world already knew the story it wanted to tell. The jewels, the princes, the movie star husband, the Woolworth fortune. For decades, newspapers had followed her like a procession, counting her marriages, measuring her diamonds, tracking her illnesses, watching her body grow thinner, her fortune shrink, and her name become a warning people repeated with a strange kind of pleasure. They called her the poor little rich girl. But that phrase was never as innocent as it sounded. It made her pain sound decorative, almost fashionable, as if sadness looked different when it wore pearls, as if a woman born into millions had no right to be lonely, as if money could cancel grief, choose faithful husbands, silence gossip, protect a child, or teach a person how to trust. Barbara Hutton had once been one of the richest women in the world. Her grandfather, Frank W. Woolworth, had built a retail empire from 5 and 10-cent stores, ordinary little purchases that became an extraordinary fortune. The Woolworth Company grew from the idea that small things, sold again and again, could build something enormous. Cheap goods became millions, nickels and dimes became palaces, and one granddaughter became so valuable that the world seemed to see her price before it saw her face. That was the first contradiction of Barbara Hutton's life. Her fortune came from ordinary people, but it made ordinary life impossible for her. By the time she died in 1979, she was no longer the dazzling young heiress in society photographs. The Washington Post reported that she died of a heart attack at 66, inside her penthouse suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills, after years in which she had become ill and increasingly withdrawn. The public remembered the glamour. But the final image was quieter. A woman in a hotel suite, surrounded not by the safety money was supposed to buy, but by the remains of a life almost everyone had watched and almost no one had understood. And that is where the real story begins. Not with the marriages, not with the jewels, not even with the money. The real story begins with a question Barbara could never escape. When everyone knows what you are worth, how do you know who loves you? For most of her life, people came close to Barbara through the door of money. Some wanted access, some wanted status, some wanted rescue. Some may have loved her too. But the tragedy was that Barbara could never be completely sure. That uncertainty became the shadow behind every romance, every headline, every new title attached to her name. The public saw a woman who could buy almost anything. But behind the photographs was a child who had lost the one thing money could not replace, a feeling of safety before the world learned her price. That is why Barbara Hutton's story cannot be told as a simple tale of a spoiled heiress who spent too much and married badly. That version is easy. It is also cruelly incomplete. Because before the palaces, before the princes, before Cary Grant, before the divorces, before the world turned her pain into entertainment, Barbara Hutton was a little girl born into a fortune so large it became a cage. And the first door of that cage opened long before she understood the word inheritance. It opened inside a family where money was everywhere, but protection was not. Barbara Woolworth Hutton was born in New York City on November 14, 1912. On paper, she entered the world protected by two powerful names. Her mother was Edna Woolworth, daughter of Frank W. Woolworth, the retail magnate behind the 5 and 10-cent store empire. Her father was Franklin Hutton, connected to the world of brokerage, finance, and Wall Street. Before Barbara could walk, her life was already attached to retail money, investment money, and a future other people would spend years calculating. But wealth did not make her childhood stable. It made it watched. The Woolworth fortune had been built from ordinary objects: ribbons, buttons, dishes, toys, thread, small household goods, things customers could buy cheaply and quickly. Frank Woolworth's genius was repetition. One small sale meant little. Millions of small sales became a chain, and that chain became one of the most recognizable businesses in America. That was the strange beginning of Barbara's life. Millions of ordinary people walked into Woolworth stores looking for something affordable, and from that river of small coins came a little girl who would become almost too rich to live normally. But the first wound did not come from the money itself. It came from loss. When Barbara was still a small child, her mother, Edna, died. Later accounts commonly connect Edna's death to suffocation caused by mastoiditis, while rumors of suicide followed the family story for years. Because the record and the whispers never fully separated in public retellings, this detail has to be handled carefully. What can be said with certainty is simpler and more devastating. Barbara lost her mother early. For a child, that fact was enough. Some later accounts claim Barbara discovered her mother's body. That detail has been repeated in biographies and popular retellings, but it should not be treated as a fully settled scene unless directly sourced. Still, whether Barbara witnessed the moment herself or only grew up under its shadow, the emotional result is hard to ignore. A mother vanished, a home became unsafe, a child learned early that the person who should have stayed could disappear without warning. And then came the second wound. After Edna's death, Barbara was raised largely by relatives and caregivers. Her father, Franklin Hutton, remained part of the financial structure around her life. But by many accounts, he was not the steady emotional center a child needed. Barbara had money assigned to her, money managed for her, money spoken about around her, but affection was not something a trust fund could guarantee. This is where the tragedy becomes sharper. Most children first learn who they are from the way adults hold them, comfort them, correct them, and return to them. Barbara learned that she was valuable. That is not the same thing as being loved. Her value could be counted. Her inheritance could be structured. Her name could be printed. Her future could be discussed by lawyers, bankers, relatives, and society watchers. But who was protecting the child inside all that value? That question would follow her for the rest of her life. Because once a girl grows up knowing that her money speaks before she does, every relationship becomes complicated. Every smile can hide a calculation. Every proposal can sound like rescue and still feel like a transaction. Every new person can seem warm until the fortune enters the room first. Barbara Hutton's origin wound was not simply that she lost her mother. It was that after the loss, the world did not treat her mainly as a grieving child. It treated her as an heiress. And before long, America would be ready to meet that heiress in public. Not gently, not privately, but under lights, flowers, music, and newspaper ink, in a debutante spectacle so extravagant it would turn a lonely young woman into a national target. In 1930, Barbara Hutton was 18 years old. That should have been the age when a young woman entered society, smiled for photographs, danced under chandeliers, and began the life her family had prepared for her. For another girl, a debutante ball might have been a celebration. For Barbara, it became a public trial. The country was in the Great Depression. Banks had failed, men were standing in bread lines, families were losing homes, jobs, and hope. Across America, ordinary people were learning how quickly security could disappear. And then came the Woolworth heiress. Barbara's debutante ball was held in New York high society with the kind of luxury that seemed almost designed to offend a suffering country. Later accounts have long described the event as costing around $60,000, an astonishing sum during the Depression. The guest list reportedly included names from families like the Astors and Rockefellers, and entertainment was said to include Rudy Vallee and Maurice Chevalier. To the people inside the ballroom, it may have looked like tradition. To the people outside, it looked like insult. That was the moment Barbara Hutton became more than a rich girl. She became a symbol. And symbols are dangerous because they stop being human. The newspapers did not simply report that a young heiress had entered society. They turned her into proof of everything ordinary Americans resented: inherited money, careless luxury, social privilege, and a world where one girl's party could cost more than many families would see in years. But here is the part the public did not want to see. Barbara had not built the fortune. She had not created the Depression. She had not chosen to become a national target. She was 18, motherless, watched, wealthy, and emotionally unprotected, standing inside a celebration that made the world angrier at her than it was curious about her. That was the cruel genius of the poor little rich girl label. It sounded sympathetic, but underneath it carried judgment. Poor little rich girl, as if her pain was cute. Poor little rich girl, as if loneliness became less real when surrounded by orchids and champagne. Poor little rich girl, as if the public could pity her and punish her at the same time. After the backlash, Barbara was reportedly sent abroad to escape the press. But leaving America did not free her from the story. It only made the story travel with her. Because once the world decides what you represent, it rarely asks who you are. Barbara's public image had been born before her adult life had even begun. She was not yet a wife, not yet a mother, not yet the woman whose marriages would fill gossip columns for decades. But the outline was already there. Money, spectacle, envy, pity, resentment. And inside that outline was a young woman learning a brutal lesson. Her fortune would open doors. But every door would lead into a room where people had already made up their minds. Some would want her because she was rich. Some would hate her because she was rich. Some would pretend to love her because she was rich. And Barbara, still barely out of childhood, would spend years trying to tell the difference. The debutante ball was supposed to introduce her to society. Instead, it introduced her to the public appetite for watching a rich girl fall. And soon, the first men in her life would learn what the newspapers had already learned. Barbara Hutton's money was not just a background detail. It was the first thing everyone saw. Barbara Hutton met Prince Alexis Mdivani after the debutante scandal had already made her famous. She was no longer just a young woman entering society. She was the Woolworth heiress, the girl newspapers could describe with a number before they described her face. By the time she reached her early 20s, the world already knew two things about her. She was rich, and she was vulnerable. That combination attracted attention. Alexis Mdivani came with a title, charm, and the kind of European glamour American heiresses had been taught to admire. He was often described as a Georgian prince, part of a family whose members moved through high society with style, confidence, and a reputation for marrying well. To Barbara, he may have looked like an escape from the American press, a doorway into a more romantic, old-world life. But that was only the surface. In 1933, Barbara married Alexis Mdivani in Paris. She was 20 years old. The marriage turned her from a mocked American debutante into something the newspapers could package even more easily: the dime store heiress who married a prince. It did not matter whether that phrase was fair. It was printable. The public had already decided that Barbara's money made every romance suspicious. If a man loved her, people asked what he wanted. If she gave him money, people called her foolish. If she married a title, people laughed as if the whole thing proved what they had believed from the beginning. And inside that laughter was Barbara's first adult humiliation. Her marriage was not allowed to be private. It became another public transaction, another spectacle, another chance for strangers to debate whether she was being loved or used. The Washington Post later reported that she and Mdivani divorced in Reno in 1935, and that she was supposed to have settled $2 million on him while he was still her husband. That phrase, "supposed to," matters. It keeps the claim in the language of report and reputation, not courtroom certainty. The emotional truth of the marriage is harder to prove, but the pattern it left behind was clear enough. Barbara entered marriage looking for protection. The world saw a payout. That is the tragedy of this chapter. It was not simply that the marriage failed. Many marriages fail. It was that Barbara's first marriage taught her a brutal lesson. Even intimacy could become a financial headline. And then the story turned darker. Not long after the divorce, Alexis Mdivani died in a car accident. The Washington Post later noted that he died shortly after the marriage ended. For the newspapers, the ingredients were irresistible: the recently divorced prince, the Woolworth heiress, the settlement, the crash, the strange end of a glittering mistake. Barbara had barely escaped one public humiliation before the next shadow arrived. By 1935, she was still young, still rich, still watched, and still searching for the thing she had wanted all along: someone who could make the fortune feel less like a trap. Instead, she moved almost immediately into another titled marriage. This time, the man would not only touch her money. The marriage would reach into her home, her body, her citizenship, and her future as a mother. And the damage would be much harder to walk away from. Within 24 hours of divorcing Prince Alexis Mdivani, Barbara Hutton married again. This time, the man was Count Kurt Haugwitz-Reventlow, a Danish nobleman with another title, another polished European name, and another promise that Barbara might finally become more than a fortune people wanted to spend. She was still barely in her 20s. To the newspapers, it was perfect material. The Woolworth heiress leaving one titled man and marrying another almost immediately. To the public, it looked reckless. To Barbara, it may have felt like movement, and movement by then was one of the only ways she knew how to escape pain. But escape can look dangerously similar to repetition. The marriage produced the one relationship that would matter more than any husband ever could. Her son, Lance. He was born in London in 1936, and suddenly Barbara had something money alone could not create. A child, a blood connection, a reason to imagine a home that was not just another hotel suite, ship cabin, or rented palace. For a moment, the story seemed to change. Barbara was no longer only the poor little rich girl, she was a mother. And around that new role she tried to build protection in brick, gardens, gates, and walls. In 1935, when Barbara was 23, she acquired the site of St. Dunstan's Villa in Regent's Park, London. The official history of Winfield House connects the property to Barbara Hutton's concern for the safety and security of her young son, and records that the Crown Estate Commission granted permission in August 1936 for the old structure to be demolished and replaced. The new house was completed in January 1938 and named Winfield House after her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth. That detail matters. Because Winfield House was not just another mansion. It was Barbara trying to build the thing she had never fully had. A protected world. A house with gardens. A house with controlled entrances. A house where her son might be guarded from the dangers that haunted rich children in the 1930s. A house where money might finally become shelter instead of bait. But the contradiction was already inside the walls. While Barbara was building a home for safety, her marriage was becoming another public wound. The Washington Post later described the marriage as lasting 6 years and reported that Lance was heavily guarded during childhood because of kidnapping fears. That one detail tells the whole story. Her son was rich enough to need protection before he was old enough to understand danger. And then even motherhood became entangled with control. By 1939, Time reported that Barbara Kurt Haugwitz-Reventlow had agreed in Britain's High Court of Justice to give Count Kurt Haugwitz-Reventlow custody, care, and superintendence of their 2.5-year-old son Lance until he was 21. Barbara had built walls, gates, and gardens around her son's safety. But in court, even motherhood became something that could be negotiated, scheduled, and divided. Once again, the old wound returned in a new form. Money everywhere, safety nowhere. The woman who had been treated like a fortune before she was treated like a child was now watching her own son become part of a legal and social battle shaped by the same forces: status, money, custody, fear, and public attention. Winfield House would survive. It would later be damaged during the war, given to the United States government, and become the official residence of the American ambassador to the court of St. James's. The house found a permanent purpose. Barbara did not. And just when her life seemed trapped between titled husbands, court arrangements, and a child she could not fully protect, another man entered the story. One very different from the princes and counts before him. A Hollywood star. A man the newspapers expected to be just another husband. But Cary Grant would complicate the legend of Barbara Hutton in a way almost no one expected. By the time Barbara Hutton met Cary Grant, the world thought it already understood her. She was the Woolworth heiress, the poor little rich girl, the woman with titles in her past and headlines in her future, the fortune people could measure, mock, envy, and chase. Cary Grant entered the story from a different kind of mythology. He was not a prince, he was not an old European title, he was Hollywood. Polished, funny, elegant, impossibly controlled. By the early 1940s, Grant was one of the most recognizable actors in the world, a man whose screen image seemed to promise ease in a life where Barbara had known very little of it. In 1942, Barbara Hutton married Cary Grant. Contemporary accounts and later obituaries identify him as one of her husbands, and the marriage lasted until 1945. To the press, the match was irresistible. The movie star and the Woolworth heiress. The glamour almost wrote itself. But the gossip writers found a sharper phrase. They called them cash and carry. It was cruel, but it worked. The nickname reduced both of them into a joke. Her as money, him as a man carrying it away. It did not matter that the truth was more complicated. It did not matter that Grant already had fame, income, and a name of his own. The public had been trained to see Barbara's fortune first, so every man near her was placed under suspicion. That is what made this marriage different. Cary Grant did not fit the easy pattern. The Washington Post later noted that Grant did not ask for or receive any of Barbara's money after the divorce. That detail matters because it breaks the cheap version of the story. Not every man in Barbara's life can be reduced to exploitation. Not every failed marriage was a theft. But even the exception could not save her from the public story. Their divorce came in 1945. Reports at the time said Barbara accused Grant of causing her emotional distress. Like many public divorces, the legal language turned private disappointment into something strangers could read and repeat. The marriage ended quickly, and the press moved on with the same appetite it had always had. But for Barbara, this failure may have carried a different kind of sting. If Cary Grant was the exception, the marriage still ended with the same public result: another divorce. Another headline, another reason for strangers to believe Barbara Hutton was impossible to love. That was the wound beneath the glamour. Barbara's tragedy was not simply that men used her. It was that even when the story could not be reduced to money, love still did not hold. For a short time, Cary Grant complicated the legend. He gave the public a version of Barbara's life that was not only about princes, settlements, and titles. He showed that someone famous in his own right could stand beside her without needing the Woolworth name to become visible. But the marriage still collapsed, and collapse, for Barbara, always became public property. After Cary Grant, the legend hardened again. The press could return to the version it understood best. Barbara Hutton, as the woman who had everything except the ability to keep a husband, the woman whose fortune seemed to attract romance and destroy it at the same time. That version was incomplete. But it was useful, and gossip loves a useful woman. Soon, Barbara would leave Hollywood's brightness and move back into the world of international titles, racing drivers, diplomats, playboys, and men whose names came wrapped in danger. The next chapter would not soften the story. It would push Barbara even deeper into the role the newspapers had been writing for her all along. A woman so rich, the world refused to believe her pain was real. By the late 1940s, Barbara Hutton's love life was no longer treated as private life. It had become a public sport. The world around her had changed. The war was over. Europe was rebuilding. Old titles still carried glamour, but many of the old fortunes behind them had weakened. The new international society was forming around hotels, casinos, Riviera parties, racing circuits, private houses, diplomatic receptions, and gossip columns that moved faster than sympathy ever could. Barbara fit that world perfectly. Or at least, the newspapers thought she did. In 1947, she married Prince Igor Troubetzkoy. He was a Russian aristocrat and racing driver, a man whose life carried speed, danger, exile, and title. Exactly the kind of combination gossip columns knew how to sell. The National Portrait Gallery identifies Troubetzkoy among Hutton's notable husbands, alongside Cary Grant. But this marriage was not just another title attached to Barbara's name. It became another public test of whether anyone could love her without the fortune standing between them. Troubetzkoy had his own world. He was associated with auto racing and European glamour, a man whose name did not need Barbara's money to sound interesting. But glamour was not stability, and for Barbara, speed had always been easier to find than safety. The marriage ended in divorce in 1951. By then, the public pattern had hardened. Barbara married. The newspapers watched. The marriage broke. The world called it proof. Proof that she was foolish. Proof that money ruined her. Proof that she could not choose well. Proof that a woman with millions still somehow did not know how to live. But the truth was less simple. Barbara was not only choosing men badly, she was moving through a world where her money entered every room before she did. Even when a man had a title, fame, or his own reputation, the Woolworth fortune stayed in the center of the story like a third person in the marriage. And then came Porfirio Rubirosa. By the early 1950s, Rubirosa was already famous in international society. a Dominican diplomat, polo player, racing figure, and one of the most notorious playboys of the era. Vanity Fair later described him as a central figure of the 1950s jet set, surrounded by sports cars, polo, and high-profile women, including Barbara Hutton. Barbara married him in 1953. The marriage lasted only weeks. That number became a kind of punchline. It was short enough for the public to laugh, short enough for gossip to turn pain into comedy, short enough for Barbara to become, once again, a spectacle instead of a person. But listen to what that spectacle hid. By this point, Barbara was not the 18-year-old debutante America resented during the Depression. She was a woman in her 40s, already marked by failed marriages, custody battles, illness, public judgment, and the constant suspicion that every new romance came with a price tag. The press did not need to understand that. It only needed the next headline. And Barbara kept giving it one. Not because she was shallow, but because loneliness can make repetition look like hope. She was still searching for the same thing she had searched for since childhood. Someone who could enter her life without turning her money into the main character. Instead, the public kept turning her into a lesson. A rich woman who could not be happy. A fortune that could not buy love. A name that attracted men and mockery in equal measure. By the time her marriage to Rubirosa collapsed, Barbara Hutton's image had almost fully separated from the woman herself. The world no longer watched to see if she would be loved. It watched to see how the next love would fail. And behind that image, something more dangerous was beginning to happen. The fortune was still visible, but the woman behind it was starting to disappear. By the time Barbara Hutton reached her later marriages, the collapse was no longer only emotional. It had entered her body. Behind the photographs and gossip columns was a woman dealing with real physical decline. The Washington Post later reported that during her marriage to Prince Troubetzkoy, she underwent major surgery for kidney and intestinal problems. In 1969, cataract surgery left her with impaired vision. Later, after tripping on a carpet in Rome, she broke her hip and suffered complications. That is the part glamour almost always hides. A headline can say heiress, a photograph can show jewels, a gossip column can count husbands, but none of that shows the body becoming fragile, the eyesight failing, the rooms getting smaller, the world outside becoming harder to enter. By the late 1950s, Barbara Hutton was still rich enough to appear untouchable. She had lived in New York, London, Paris, Tangier, Mexico, and Beverly Hills. She had owned grand houses, traveled with jewels, married titled men, Hollywood fame, athletic glamour, and diplomatic charm. Her name still opened doors. But behind the image, the structure was weakening. The marriages had not simply ended. They had taken pieces of her with them. Money, health, privacy, confidence, and the belief that the next beginning might finally be different. In 1955, Barbara married Baron Gottfried von Kram, the German tennis star. On paper, he seemed different from the playboys and princes before him. He was not merely a title. He had been an international athlete, a man with his own reputation. They married in November 1955 and later divorced. To the outside world, it looked like another glamorous chapter. But glamour had become Barbara's most unreliable disguise. The Washington Post later reported that this marriage ended quietly by mutual agreement. That phrase sounds civilized, almost clean. But for Barbara, even a quiet divorce still became part of the same public pattern. Another husband, another failure, another headline teaching strangers how to laugh at her life. By then, the story had become bigger than the woman. Barbara could not simply be lonely, she had to be the lonely heiress. She could not simply be ill, she had to be the frail rich woman. She could not simply make a mistake. She had to prove that money ruined people. And then came the last marriage. In 1964, Barbara married Raymond Doan, described in later accounts as Prince Raymond Doan Vinna Champasak. The Washington Post reported that they separated by 1966 after 2 years of marriage. By this point, the details almost sound unreal. A Woolworth fortune, a Hollywood star, princes, counts, a baron, a diplomat, homes around the world. A woman pursued by gossip columns for nearly her entire adult life. But the real collapse was not in the number of marriages. It was in what those marriages had failed to give her. None of them restored the mother she lost. None of them removed the suspicion around her money. None of them made the public see her as fully human. None of them gave her the simple, ordinary privacy that poorer people often take for granted. The glamorous woman in the photographs was being replaced by someone more fragile. Someone who moved less. Someone who depended more on attendants, doctors, lawyers, and staff. Someone whose fortune had once seemed endless but whose world was now shrinking into rooms. And that was the cruelest reversal. Barbara Hutton had spent her life moving, from country to country, house to house, husband to husband, trying to outrun the old wound. But in the end, movement stopped protecting her. The palaces became memories. The jewels became inventory. The titles became footnotes. The marriages became jokes told by people who never had to live them. And just when it seemed there was almost nothing left for the world to take from Barbara Hutton, the one person who still connected her to a deeper kind of love was about to disappear. Her son, Lance, had survived the guards, the custody battles, the newspapers, and the strange childhood of being born inside a fortune. But he would not survive what came next. For most of Barbara Hutton's life, people counted what she lost in money. They counted the settlements, the houses, the jewels, the husbands, the fortune that seemed to shrink every time another chapter of her life became public. But the loss that broke her was not a diamond, a title, or a marriage. It was Lance. Lance Reventlow was Barbara's only child, born in London in 1936 during her marriage to Count Kurt Haugwitz-Reventlow. From the beginning, his life carried the same contradiction that had shaped hers. He was protected by money, but also trapped inside it. As a boy, Lance had guards around him because kidnapping fears followed children with fortunes. His childhood was touched by custody disputes, public attention, and the strange pressure of being born not only as a son, but as an heir. Barbara had tried to build safety around him. Winfield House, security, staff, distance from danger. But no house, no fortune, and no guard could give her permanent control over fate. As an adult, Lance tried to become something more than Barbara Hutton's son. He entered auto racing, built the Scarab racing cars, and made his own name in a world of speed, risk, engineering, and competition. Time later described him as an auto racer and heir to the Woolworth 5 and 10 fortune, noting that he had devoted much of his inheritance to racing and had won Nassau's 1958 Governor's Cup race in a car he both designed and drove. That detail matters, because Lance was not simply another rich son drifting through inherited money. He wanted a machine he could build, a race he could enter, a reputation he could earn. For Barbara, that may have meant something deeper than pride. Her son was doing what she had struggled to do all her life: step out from under the weight of inherited money and become known for something active, chosen, and his own. Then, in 1972, the old wound returned in its cruelest form. On July 24, 1972, Lance Reventlow died in a plane crash near Aspen, Colorado. He was 36 years old. Time reported his death shortly afterward, identifying him as Barbara Hutton's son and a former racer. The facts were simple: a plane, a crash, a young man dead, a mother left behind. But for Barbara, the meaning was not simple at all. Lance had been the one relationship no newspaper could reduce to a marriage settlement. He was not a prince, not a playboy, not a headline husband, not a man who entered her life through romance and left through lawyers. He was her son. And now he was gone. The world had watched Barbara Hutton lose husbands before. It had watched her lose privacy. It had watched her lose youth, health, and public sympathy. But this loss was different because there was no performance left inside it. No glamour could soften it. No money could reverse it. No new marriage could distract from it. After Lance's death, Barbara's life seemed to narrow. Reports from her final years described illness, isolation, impaired vision, and a woman increasingly withdrawn from the society that had once followed her so aggressively. The Washington Post later called her a former jet-setter who became an ailing recluse after her 7th marriage failed. But that phrase only tells part of the truth. Barbara had not simply withdrawn because marriages failed. She had outlived the person who may have mattered most. And once Lance was gone, the old question that had haunted her from childhood came back one final time. What is a fortune worth when it cannot keep the people you love alive? By the end, Barbara Hutton still had a famous name. But the name no longer looked like protection. It looked like an echo, After Barbara Hutton died in 1979, the world returned to the same story it had always preferred. The marriages, the jewels, the wasted millions, the princes, the hotel suite, the lonely ending. It was easier that way. A woman born into the Woolworth fortune, once one of the richest women in the world, died at 66 in her penthouse suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills. Contemporary reports said she had become ill and withdrawn in her final years, far from the glittering international society that once made her famous. That ending gave the public a simple moral: money cannot buy happiness. But Barbara Hutton's life was never that simple. Money did buy things. It bought houses, travel, jewels, security, medical care, servants, access, and escape routes. It bought Wingfield House in Regent's Park, the London mansion she built in the 1930s and later gave to the United States government. By 1946, it had become the American ambassador's residence to the court of St. James's. So the question was not whether money could buy anything. The question was what happened when money became the first thing everyone saw. Barbara's public identity was built around wealth before it was built around personhood. She was the Woolworth heiress, the debutante, the poor little rich girl, the woman who married famous men, titled men, glamorous men, dangerous men. Even now, major institutions remember her through public labels: socialite, heiress, philanthropist, and wife to famous men, including Cary Grant and Prince Igor Troubetzkoy. Those labels are not false, but they are not enough. Because the wound in Barbara Hutton's story began long before the final marriage failed. It began with a child who inherited a fortune before she inherited safety. It began when adults, newspapers, suitors, lawyers, relatives, and strangers all learned to speak about her value in numbers. That is what people still get wrong. Barbara Hutton was not tragic because she was rich. She was tragic because wealth made it almost impossible for her to know when she was being loved without calculation. Every romance arrived under suspicion. Every husband became a public theory. Every gift could be read as foolishness. Every divorce became proof that she had failed again. Even her pain was treated like a luxury item, something polished, excessive, and faintly ridiculous. But pain does not become smaller because the room is expensive, and loneliness does not become less real because there are jewels on the table. Her son Lance was the one relationship that cut through the old public joke. He was not a title, not a settlement, not a gossip column husband. He was the child she had tried to protect, the person who made the fortune feel briefly connected to something more human than display. When he died in 1972, something in Barbara's story closed. After that, the world still had its old vocabulary for her: heiress, recluse, spendthrift, poor little rich girl, but those words could not reach the private scale of that loss. By the end, Barbara Hutton had become a kind of cautionary tale. But cautionary tales often flatten the people inside them. They turn a woman into a lesson. They make her useful after death, in the same way her fortune made her useful in life. Maybe the fairer question is not, how did she lose so much? Maybe it is, how many times can a person be treated as a fortune before she stops believing anyone sees the child behind it? That was Barbara Hutton's hidden tragedy. She could buy palaces. She could marry princes. She could enter the grandest rooms in the world. But from the beginning to the end, the thing she needed most was never another title, another house, or another diamond. It was the one thing no inheritance could secure: to be loved without being priced.